Some prisons lock men away. Others erase them completely. And what happened inside Folsom State Prison was darker than most people were ever meant to hear. Folsom State Prison rises from Northern California, like a fortress built to outlive the men trapped inside it. Long before tourists bought Johnny Cash records or true crime documentaries turned prison stories into entertainment, Folsom already had blood in its history. Cold stone walls, rusted bars, watchtowers staring down like silent judges. For more than a century, men disappeared behind those gates. Some came in violent, some came in terrified. Almost all of them changed. The prison sits beside the American River, isolated enough to feel forgotten, but close enough for inmates to hear the outside world continuing without them. Cars pass. Families laugh. Music drifts from distant roads. Freedom exists only a few hundred yards away, close enough to torture the mind. Inside Folsom, time moves differently. The prison officially opened in 1880, but the story began years earlier when California wanted a place that could contain the growing violence spreading through the state after the gold rush. Crime was rising fast. Law enforcement was overwhelmed. Politicians demanded control. So they built Folsom, not as a place for rehabilitation, as a warning. The prison itself was constructed by inmate labor. Men carved granite from the surrounding land and hauled massive stones under armed supervision. Every wall, every corridor, every cell block was built by prisoners who knew they might never leave alive. The message was clear from the beginning. You are not here to heal. You are here to disappear. The first inmates lived in brutal conditions. Tiny iron cages stacked close together. Barely enough room to stretch. No privacy. No silence. At night, the sounds echoed endlessly through the prison. Metal rattling, coughing, whispered threats, distant screaming. Some men adapted quickly. Others broke almost immediately. By the early 1900s, Folsom had already developed a reputation across America. Newspapers called it one of the harshest prisons in the country. Guards ruled through fear. Punishments were severe. Solitary confinement became one of the prison's most feared weapons. Inmates called it the hole, a dark concrete box where time lost meaning. Some men entered the hole angry. Many came out hollow. Others never mentally returned at all. But the real danger inside Folsom was never just the guards. It was the inmates themselves. Every new arrival faced the same terrifying reality. The moment those prison gates slammed shut behind them, they entered a world built entirely on unwritten rules. Rules nobody explained. Rules everyone obeyed. A young inmate named Daniel Mercer learned that reality on his first day inside. 23 years old. Convicted of armed robbery. Sentenced to 15 years after a failed liquor store holdup left a clerk seriously injured. Daniel entered Folsom believing he was tough enough to survive. He was wrong. The first thing he noticed wasn't the violence. It was the silence. Not complete silence. Worse, controlled silence. Hundreds of men speaking quietly, carefully, constantly aware of who might be listening. Guards processed him quickly. Fingerprints. Mugshot. Prison uniform. His civilian clothes disappeared into a plastic bag, along with the last visible pieces of his old life. An officer shoved him forward through the intake corridor. "Keep your eyes ahead," the guard muttered. Daniel ignored the warning. That was mistake number one. He glanced too long at another inmate passing by. The man was older, heavily tattooed, with cold gray eyes that lingered on Daniel for half a second too long. Nothing happened immediately. But inside Folsom, mistakes were remembered. The cell block smelled like sweat, bleach, old concrete, and something heavier beneath it all. Desperation. Metal doors slammed endlessly. Voices echoed through the tiers. Some inmates exercised in tiny spaces between cells. Others stared blankly through bars, as though mentally escaping somewhere far beyond the prison walls. Daniel's cellmate was a lifer named Raymond Pike, 58 years old. Inside Folsom since 1987. Raymond barely looked up when Daniel entered. "You got family?" Raymond asked quietly. "Yeah. They'll stop visiting eventually." Daniel forced a laugh. Raymond didn't. That night, Daniel barely slept. The prison never truly rested. Somewhere down the corridor, two inmates screamed at each other through bars. A guard yelled back. Metal clanged violently against steel. Then came the sound nobody forgot once they heard it. A scream cut short. Silence followed. The next morning, Daniel learned his second lesson about Folsom. Violence rarely announced itself. Breakfast lasted less than 15 minutes. Inmates moved carefully, eyes scanning constantly. Groups sat separately, divided by race, gang affiliation, alliances formed years earlier. Nobody sat randomly. Nobody ate alone unless they wanted trouble. Daniel accidentally chose the wrong table. The cafeteria quieted almost instantly. Not completely. Just enough. An older inmate approached slowly. Bald head. Scar running across his jawline. "You lost," the man asked calmly. Daniel realized too late what he'd done. Raymond appeared behind him before things escalated further. "He's new," Raymond said quietly. The older inmate studied Daniel for several seconds before stepping away. But as he walked off, he smiled slightly. Not kindly, like someone making a future decision. Back in the housing unit, Raymond finally explained the truth. "Folsom ain't about strength," he said. "It's about understanding pressure." Daniel frowned. "What pressure?" Raymond looked around the tier before lowering his voice. "Everybody in here owes somebody something. Protection, favors, information. The second you walk through these gates, people start measuring what you're worth." Over the following weeks, Daniel saw how the prison really functioned. Guards controlled the schedules. Inmates controlled everything else. Contraband moved through invisible networks. Debts circulated like currency. Violence erupted suddenly over things outsiders would never understand. A glance, a rumor, a disrespectful word. And then there were the lockdowns. One afternoon, alarms exploded across the prison yard. Inmates hit the ground instantly. Guards shouted from towers with rifles aimed downward. Daniel froze for one fatal second too long. An inmate beside him yanked him violently onto the concrete just as officers stormed the yard. Somewhere near the basketball courts, a man lay bleeding beside overturned benches. Nobody spoke. Nobody asked questions. By evening, the prison was sealed completely. Cells locked. Meals shoved through slots. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some said it was gang retaliation. Others whispered about contraband gone missing. But Raymond told Daniel something far worse. It wasn't random. Daniel looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Raymond hesitated. Then he leaned closer. "The guy who got hit yesterday? He was supposed to testify about something happening inside these walls." Daniel's stomach tightened. Testify about what? Raymond stared toward the dark corridor outside their cell. Then he spoke quietly. Correctional officers running deals with inmates. Daniel felt cold suddenly, because at that exact moment, footsteps stopped outside their cell door, and someone whispered through the bars. "Raymond talks too much." The footsteps outside the cell disappeared as suddenly as they came. Raymond Pike remained perfectly still on the lower bunk, his eyes locked on the dark corridor beyond the bars. Around them, the prison continued breathing through layers of distant noise, metal doors slamming, guards shouting count numbers, toilets flushing somewhere down the tier. But inside cell 214, silence settled like smoke. Daniel Mercer swallowed hard. Who was that? Raymond didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly stood and moved closer to the bars, staring into the empty walkway outside. His weathered face showed no panic. That was somehow worse. Finally, he stepped back. "You didn't hear anything," Raymond said quietly. Daniel frowned. "Somebody threatened you." "No," Raymond corrected. "Somebody warned me." Outside, the overhead lights flickered briefly before stabilizing again. The old prison electrical system failed often, but inmates inside Folsom understood something outsiders never did. Darkness was dangerous, because darkness gave people opportunities. That night, neither man slept much. Daniel lay awake listening to whispers travel through the plumbing pipes between cells. Inmates communicated that way during lockdowns, tapping coded messages through metal and concrete. Entire conversations moved across the prison without guards hearing a word. Folsom operated like a city hidden beneath another city, a system inside the system. And somewhere inside that hidden structure, Raymond had become a problem. The next morning, lockdown restrictions eased. Inmates were released in controlled groups for showers and limited movement. Tension moved through the prison like electricity. Everyone knew something serious had happened in the yard. Nobody spoke openly about it. Daniel followed Raymond carefully through the corridor. He noticed how other inmates watched the older man now, not casually but cautiously. Some looked away immediately. Others stared too long. Fear traveled fast inside prison walls. By afternoon, Daniel finally learned the name of the inmate who had been attacked. Luis Ortega, 42 years old, serving life without parole for organized crime-related murder charges. But according to whispers spreading across the prison, Ortega had secretly agreed to cooperate with outside investigators examining corruption inside Folsom itself. Correctional officers, contraband trafficking, protection rackets, smuggling operations moving drugs, phones, and weapons through prison walls with inside help. Daniel struggled to process it. "You're saying guards are involved?" Raymond gave a tired nod. "Not all of them, but enough." "How do you know?" Raymond looked directly at him. "Because I used to help move the product." Daniel felt his chest tighten. For the first time since arriving at Folsom, he realized Raymond Pike wasn't simply another aging inmate trying to survive his sentence. He was connected, deeply connected. Years earlier, Raymond had worked prison maintenance. The job allowed him access to areas most inmates never saw: utility corridors, supply rooms, delivery zones. Perfect locations for smuggling. At first, Raymond claimed he only carried messages. Then came cigarettes, drugs later, phones after that. Guards received money. Inmates received protection and access. Everyone benefited, until people started dying. One overdose changed everything, Raymond admitted quietly. The inmate had been 19 years old. First sentence. Dead inside his cell from fentanyl hidden in a shipment that should never have entered the prison. Raymond still remembered watching officers remove the body before sunrise, while the rest of the housing unit remained locked behind steel doors. "That kid never even made it to 20, Raymond muttered. After that, Raymond tried distancing himself from the operation. Nobody simply walked away from systems like that, especially not inside Folsom. "What about Ortega?" Daniel asked. Raymond hesitated. He wanted out too. That evening, the prison yard reopened under heavy supervision. Watchtower officers scanned constantly with rifles, while inmates moved carefully across the concrete recreation area. Nobody trusted the temporary calm. Folsom's peace was always fragile. Daniel noticed clear divisions everywhere now. Small groups standing together. Conversations stopping when certain people walked past. Eyes constantly tracking movement. Near the handball courts, Daniel spotted the bald inmate with a scarred jaw again. The same man from the cafeteria. This time, the man approached directly. "Mercer," he said calmly. Daniel froze. The man smiled slightly. "You're Raymond's new shadow." Daniel said nothing. The inmate extended his hand casually. "Name's Cole." Daniel reluctantly shook it. Cole leaned closer. "You should be careful who you spend time with in here." Then he walked away. No threat. No raised voice. Still, Daniel felt shaken afterward. Raymond noticed immediately. What did he want? "Just talking." Raymond's expression darkened. "Cole doesn't just talk." Daniel learned later that Marcus Cole controlled much of the contraband flow inside their housing block. Officially, he was serving 30 years for armed robbery and aggravated assault. Unofficially, he operated like a prison businessman, connected to inmates, connected to guards, connected to violence. That night, Raymond finally revealed the truth he had hidden. "Cole thinks Ortega gave investigators names." Daniel leaned forward. "Did he?" Raymond stayed silent too long. Then he nodded once. Daniel stared at him. "You're involved in this too." "Used to be. But if investigators already know, they don't know enough." The prison lights dimmed for nighttime count. Outside their cell, guards moved tier by tier, checking inmates visually through narrow windows. Folsom became eerily quiet during count, as though the entire prison paused, breathing together. Then came the scream. Sharp, sudden. Somewhere below them, inmates rushed toward cell bars instantly. Guards shouted orders. Radios crackled through the corridor. Daniel grabbed the bars, trying to see. 2 officers sprinted across the lower tier toward the showers. More alarms followed. Raymond's face turned pale. "That's bad," he whispered. The next hour dissolved into chaos. Emergency response teams flooded the housing unit. Inmates were forced back into cells, while officers searched corridors aggressively. Rumors spread immediately. Someone had been attacked near the shower area. Multiple stab wounds. Critical condition. By midnight, Daniel finally overheard the truth from passing guards. The victim was Marcus Cole, and before collapsing, Cole had reportedly whispered one sentence. "Pike set me up." Daniel turned slowly toward Raymond. "You told them?" Raymond looked horrified. "No." But Daniel wasn't fully convinced anymore. Too many things weren't adding up. Raymond knew about the corruption network. He knew about Ortega cooperating. Now Cole had nearly been killed after confronting them both publicly. And someone inside the prison clearly wanted blame redirected fast. The following morning, Folsom entered full lockdown again. Cells sealed. Movement suspended. Search teams tore through housing units looking for weapons. During the search, officers flipped mattresses, dumped personal property, and inspected every inch of cell 214. One younger correctional officer paused beside Raymond's bunk, then quietly slipped something beneath the mattress before moving on. Daniel saw it happen. So did Raymond. Neither spoke until the officers finally left. Then Raymond lifted the mattress slowly. Beneath it sat a homemade prison knife wrapped tightly in cloth. Daniel's blood ran cold. "It's a setup." Raymond stared at the weapon silently. Footsteps immediately returned outside. This time, not one officer. 5. The cell door exploded open. Raymond Pike stepped forward. Daniel watched in shock as guards dragged Raymond violently into the corridor. The older inmate didn't resist. But before disappearing around the tier corner, Raymond turned back toward Daniel and shouted something that changed everything. "They're using the chapel." Then a guard slammed him face first into the concrete floor, and the cell door crashed shut. The steel door slammed shut so hard the entire cell shook. Daniel Mercer stood frozen beside the bunk, Raymond's final words echoing inside his head. "They're using the chapel." Outside the cell, chaos continued down the tier. Guards shouted orders while boots pounded across concrete. Somewhere below, another inmate screamed as officers forced housing units into complete lockdown. But Daniel barely heard any of it, because suddenly everything connected. The secret meetings, the smuggling routes, the corrupt officers, the attacks on Ortega and Cole. Whatever operation existed inside Folsom State Prison, it wasn't running through maintenance corridors anymore. It was running through the one place nobody questioned, the prison chapel. Hours passed. Lockdown silence settled heavily across the housing block. Meals arrived through narrow slots in cell doors. No recreation, no showers, no movement, only waiting. Daniel sat alone on the lower bunk, staring at the wall, while fear slowly transformed into something else. Understanding. Raymond hadn't shouted those words to save himself. He had shouted them because he knew he was already finished. And now Daniel was the only person left carrying the truth. Late that night, footsteps stopped outside cell 214 again. Daniel looked up instantly. A correctional officer stood outside the bars. Officer Brennan, mid-50s, calm voice. 20 years at Folsom. Daniel recognized him immediately because Brennan was one of the few guards inmates actually trusted, or pretended to trust. Brennan glanced both directions before speaking quietly. "You want to stay alive?" Daniel said nothing. Then stopped asking questions about Raymond Pike. The officer slid a folded piece of paper beneath the cell door, then walked away without another word. Daniel waited until the corridor cleared before opening it. Inside was a single sentence. Chapel basement. Midnight. Come alone. Daniel read it 3 times. Every instinct told him it was a trap. But another part of him understood something equally dangerous. If Raymond was gone, this might be the only chance left to learn the truth. Midnight inside Folsom felt different from daytime. The prison became quieter, heavier. Like the building itself was holding its breath. At exactly 11:47 p.m., Daniel's cell door buzzed unexpectedly. Unlocked. His heart nearly stopped. That wasn't possible during lockdown, unless someone inside control had allowed it. Slowly, Daniel stepped into the dark corridor. No guards. No movement. Only distant fluorescent lights humming overhead. He moved carefully down the tier stairs toward the lower hallway. Every shadow looked dangerous now. Every sound made his pulse spike harder. The chapel sat near the older administrative wing of Folsom, separated from the main housing units by narrow corridors lined with aging concrete walls. Daniel reached it just before midnight. The chapel doors were slightly open. Inside, moonlight filtered through dusty windows onto empty wooden benches. Religious paintings hung silently across cracked walls. At first glance, it looked peaceful. Then Daniel noticed fresh, muddy footprints leading toward the altar. Behind the altar, partially hidden by storage shelves, sat a steel maintenance door. Unlocked. Daniel pulled it open slowly. A staircase descended underground. Cold air rushed upward, carrying the smell of damp concrete and bleach. Below him, faint voices echoed through darkness. Daniel moved downward carefully. The basement beneath the chapel was far larger than he expected. Old storage rooms connected through narrow corridors originally built decades earlier during prison expansion projects. But now the rooms served another purpose entirely. Boxes lined the walls. Phones, drugs, cash, weapons, contraband worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, moving through Folsom under official protection. And standing in the center of it all was Officer Brennan. Not alone. 3 other correctional officers stood nearby alongside 2 inmates Daniel recognized instantly from a yard. Everyone turned toward him simultaneously. Brennan sighed. "You should have stayed in your cell." Daniel backed away instinctively. "You framed Raymond." Brennan's expression barely changed. Raymond became emotional. Emotional people become dangerous. "You killed Ortega." "No," Brennan corrected calmly. "Cole handled Ortega." Daniel stared at him. Then Cole got greedy. One of the inmates laughed quietly. The sound felt worse than shouting. Daniel suddenly understood the terrifying truth about Folsom. The prison didn't merely contain violence. It organized it, managed it, profited from it. Brennan stepped closer. "You know why prisons like this never really change?" Daniel stayed silent. "Because nobody outside wants the truth. Politicians want control. Administrators want stability. Guards want survival. Inmates want protection." He gestured around the basement. "This place gives everyone something." Daniel's chest tightened. "You're destroying people." Brennan looked almost confused by the statement. "No," he said quietly. "The system already destroyed them. We just learned how to survive inside it." Suddenly, alarms exploded upstairs. Everyone froze. A radio crackled loudly from Brennan's belt. "Emergency response to C block. Officer down. Repeat, officer down." The basement erupted instantly into movement. One inmate grabbed boxes. Another shoved phones into bags. Officers cursed while scrambling toward the stairs. Brennan stared hard at Daniel, then made a decision. Bring him. Before Daniel could react, someone slammed him against the wall painfully hard. Hands restrained him while the group rushed upward through the stairwell. The prison above had descended into chaos again. Sirens screamed across Folsom. Red emergency lights flashed through corridors. Smoke drifted somewhere in the distance. Inmates shouted from locked cells, while officers sprinted between housing units. Another riot had started. Or maybe someone had started it deliberately. Brennan forced Daniel through the confusion toward an isolated administrative hallway. "You're leaving tonight," Brennan said coldly. Daniel realized what that meant instantly. Not transfer, not protection, disappearance. Inside prisons, people vanished all the time, especially inmates nobody powerful cared about. They reached an old security exit near the outer maintenance yard. Rain hammered the pavement outside while distant sirens echoed beyond the prison walls. Then Brennan stopped suddenly. Ahead of them stood Raymond Pike, bruised, blood running down one side of his face. Alive. 2 other inmates stood beside him, blocking the corridor completely. For the first time since Daniel met him, Raymond looked genuinely furious. "You should have killed me when you had the chance," he told Brennan quietly. The officer drew his baton instantly. Everything happened at once after that. The corridor exploded into violence. One inmate tackled a guard into the wall. Brennan swung the baton toward Raymond, while Daniel struggled free during the chaos. Shouting, footsteps, blood on concrete, radios screaming for backup. Daniel stumbled backward just as Brennan pulled a concealed knife from his belt. Raymond saw it too late. The blade drove into his side violently. Daniel heard the impact more than saw it. Brennan tried striking again, but gunfire suddenly thundered through the corridor. Everyone froze. Armed tactical officers flooded the hallway from both directions. "Drop the weapon." Brennan stared around wildly. Too late. Within seconds, officers slammed him face first onto the concrete floor. The riot outside continued for hours. By sunrise, Folsom sat under complete tactical control. Dozens of cells searched. Contraband recovered. Multiple officers arrested. News helicopters circled overhead as investigators entered the prison under armed escort. The corruption network hidden beneath Folsom had finally surfaced. But the victory felt hollow. Raymond Pike died 3 hours later in the prison infirmary. Official reports called him a violent inmate connected to organized prison smuggling operations. Most of the public never learned the full story. Maybe they never wanted to. Weeks later, Daniel sat alone inside another prison facility hundreds of miles away, watching television coverage about reforms, investigations, and administrative suspensions connected to Folsom State Prison. Politicians promised accountability. Officials promised change. Daniel turned the television off halfway through the broadcast, because now he understood something the outside world didn't. Prisons weren't only buildings. They were systems, and systems protected themselves. Late that night, another inmate approached Daniel quietly during evening count. Without speaking, the man slipped a folded piece of paper into Daniel's hand before walking away. Daniel unfolded it slowly. Inside was one sentence written in careful handwriting. Folsom was never the only one. Daniel stared at the words while distant cell doors slammed shut across the prison. And somewhere deep inside the walls, someone started screaming,